Moving now into the aphasias. So to start with, let's introduce some terms. To begin with, agnosia. This is an acquired deficit and inability to perceive or interpret some afferent sensation. So for instance, visual agnosia is a best example. And it's usually the result of damage to or dysfunction of the association areas that we discussed previously. Anosognosia. Anosognosia. This is a neurological condition in which a person is unable to acknowledge their own deficits. They're unable to perceive their own deficits. Now, this is not denial. This is not a psychological problem. This is a condition that's a result of damage or degeneration of the brain. And people with anosognosia, they may have severe deficits in the realm of communication, severe physical or perceptual deficits, and they are completely unable to acknowledge that those deficits exist. And this isn't an uncommon thing that we have to deal with as SLPs. Most of our guys with the fluent aphasias come along with some level of anosognosia, as well as your right hemisphere deficit individuals, and you see a lot of anosognosia in people with dementia. If visual agnosia is an individual's general inability to interpret what they're seeing, prosopagnosia is the specific inability of a person to interpret, to recognize the faces of people that should be familiar to them. So, Dr. P, in The Man Who Mistook His Wife for a Hat, certainly displayed the inability to visually recognize familiar faces, but he also displayed a more general inability to visually recognize pretty much anything. So you wouldn't necessarily say that he has prosopagnosia. You would say he has a probably moderate to severe visual agnosia. People with prosopagnosia are limited in their deficit to only being unable to recognize faces of people that should be familiar to them. Anomia is the primary deficit of aphasia. Pretty much everyone, regardless of aphasia type, are going to display some level of anomia. Anomia means literally naming deficit. It's an inability to find the words to name things. We always test for anomia, and in general, the presence of anomia indicates a greater and more general word-finding deficit. Agrammatism is a characteristic of most individuals with aphasia, and that means a lack of grammar. So this is a lack of syntax and morphology in their expressive language. So in other words, when they go to speak, especially your people with non-fluent aphasia, they're going to be able to oftentimes produce very important words to communicate, but they're going to be missing the individual smaller portions of the sentence where all the syntax resides. And all those small words, all the ifs, ands, or buts within your sentence that contains a lot of syntax, those are called the functor words. The content words are those words that are the nouns and the verbs. And the content words have most of the meaning of the utterance, usually. And oftentimes people with your non-fluent aphasias are able to produce content words well enough to communicate pretty well. So to give you an example, if I gave you the sentence, I ran around the block and it was fun. If I boiled that down to like content words only, and if I was to mimic how someone with especially a non-fluent aphasia might communicate that, it'd probably come out ran, block, fun, right? And with my use of facial expression and eye contact, I'm probably communicating to you the same meaning that I ran around the block and it was fun is communicating. But I have taken out all those little unnecessary, not necessarily needed functor words. People with aphasia often have some degree of preserved language, and this is usually the more automatic, overlearned, reflexive language that we as individuals use as the people with aphasia used before their stroke. So we usually test what automatic language, what preserved language an individual with aphasia has after their stroke by asking them to count from 1 to 10, asking them to recite the days of the week, asking them to sing the happy birthday song. These are overlearned bits of language that have been produced over and over again in sequence throughout our lives. And oftentimes, people with aphasia, even very severely impaired people with aphasia, are still able to produce those strings of sequential language. And if they're able to produce that, then that at least gives you a place to start in therapy, even if they have no other language. You can start teaching them volitional control over that preserved language and then building their expressive language from there. Also within the realm of preserved automatic language is the use of expletives, curse words. So very reflexive language is usually preserved in people with aphasia. Logorrhea is a characteristic usually displayed in fluent aphasias, and it is nonstop, usually meaningless verbal output. The word for language errors produced by people with aphasia is paraphasia. And there are different types of paraphasias, meaning there are different types of errors that people with aphasia make in their verbal expressive output. If an individual with aphasia produces a word, an utterance that has absolutely no real words in it, or greater than 50% not real words, we use the term neologism or neologistic paraphasia to refer to that error. So, example, if you asked a patient with aphasia, what is this? A neologistic paraphasia would be them calling it something like a plibberpop or a flickerdo or something like that there's no real words in it whatsoever, or even if there was a word in it, a real word, it is 50% or less of the utterance. Sound level errors in people with aphasia are referred to as literal or phonemic paraphasias. So if you said, what is this? And a patient with aphasia says, that's a clup. So let's say they added an L in there. They got the CUP, but they just added a sound, or they deleted a sound, or they distorted a sound. That would be a sound level error. You would refer to that as a literal paraphasia. And literal paraphasias don't inhibit communication nearly as much as neologistic paraphasias do. So if the patient is pointing at this and is saying, hand me the club, you know very well what they're talking about. A semantic paraphasia is a word level error produced by someone with aphasia. And we divide semantic paraphasias up into semantically related paraphasias and semantically unrelated paraphasias. So if you said, "What is this?" and the patient says, "Glass" or "jar," that's not right, but it's not that far off. And it's still pretty effective for communication. That would be a semantically related paraphasia. The word produced, the error, is at least related in meaning to the target word. Semantically unrelated paraphasia, if you said, like, "What is this?" and the person with aphasia says, "That's a tire," or "It's a bicycle," gives you a completely unrelated word, in which case it is very destructive to communication to have semantically unrelated paraphasias. All right, let's talk about a couple of general rules that you can generally apply, not all the time, but you can generally apply to the brain. So this is anterior, this is posterior back here, anterior, posterior. Generally speaking, if you're talking aphasia, if you're talking the left hemisphere, the more anterior the lesion is in the left hemisphere, the more likely you're going to have a non-fluent aphasia. So your non-fluent aphasias are your guys that struggle to find their words, and that inhibits the fluency of their speech, but they're usually able to understand most of what's said because the posterior part of their brain, posterior part of their left hemisphere, which houses their language area, their receptive language areas, vernix and the angular gyrus, is preserved. But the more posterior you get in your lesion gets in the brain, the closer to those receptive language areas the lesion is going to be, and the further away from Broca's area, which is your expressive language area, the lesion is going to be. So the more posterior the lesion in the left hemisphere, generally speaking, the more likely you're going to have a fluent aphasia, and the less likely you're going to have a non-fluent aphasia. And your guys with fluent aphasia, they have receptive language deficits. They don't understand very well what is said to them. They have usually a degree of logorrhea, so they usually have a great deal of verbal output, and it's usually very void of meaning. And they usually have some level of anosognosia, so they're usually unaware that they are having trouble, that they aren't correctly processing what they're hearing, and that they aren't correctly expressing what they intend to express. Also, because the frontal lobes, right and left, are where most of your areas for volitional motor movement exist. The more anterior in the brain, the more you're likely to be looking at motor areas. So the more anterior a lesion is in the brain, the more likely this person that has the lesion is going to have problems with their movement. If you look at the brain, whereas the frontal lobe does your cognition, your problem solving, your expressive language, volitional movement, if you look at the rest of the brain, posteriorly now, parietal lobe, temporal, occipital, that's all very sensory. So the more posterior you get in the brain, the more sensory related to sensation the areas become, sensation and perception. So the more posterior a lesion is in the brain, the more likely it's going to negatively affect sensation and perception. If we're talking about lesion to at or around vernix area, that's going to produce some fluent aphasia. The more anterior that lesion is on the temporal lobe, The further away from the angular gyrus that lesion is going to be, the more likely reading is going to be preserved. But the more posterior on the temporal lobe your lesion is, that we're talking about, that's going to create some degree of fluent aphasia. The more posterior that lesion is, the closer it is to the angular gyrus, the more likely it is to damage the angular gyrus as well as vernix area, making it more likely that the patient is going to have reading deficits. All right, now here I've drawn the arcuate fasciculus, and that is the band of white matter that connects vernix area, the angular gyrus, to Broca's area. And it's the arcuate fasciculus that allows you to repeat words that you hear verbatim. So if we're talking about damage to the brain, if we're talking about strokes, the further away from the arcuate fasciculus the stroke is, the more likely repetition is going to be preserved. So if we put a lesion right here, you're going to have a guy that has verbal expression deficits, but he's going to be able to understand everything that's said to him because the vernix area is intact, and the arcuate fasciculus has not been damaged, so repetition is going to be intact as well. And that would be transcortical motor aphasia. We're going to come back to that here in a second. If we put the lesion more posterior on Broca's area, so that it's damaging Broca's and it's damaging part of the arcuate fasciculus, then we have cut the arcuate fasciculus from Broca's, and we've also damaged Broca's. So this individual is going to have expressive language deficits. He's going to be able to understand everything that's said to him because the vernix area is intact, but he's not going to be able to repeat very well because the arcuate fasciculus has been damaged. And that would be a Broca's aphasia. And that same relationship holds true for the receptive language areas. If I have a lesion, let's say down here, inferior and anteriorly, that clips vernix area, I'm going to have receptive deficits, but I'm still going to be able to repeat what I hear, even though I may not necessarily be able to understand what I hear. And this would be transcortical sensory aphasia. Versus if I were to take that same lesion, redraw the arcuate fasciculus right here, and I were to damage a vernix area and part of the arcuate fasciculus, then this individual is going to have receptive language deficits. He's going to have a difficulty repeating, but Broca's area is intact, so words are going to be flowing freely out of his mouth, though due to the nature of fluent aphasia, those words are probably going to be devoid of meaning. And this would be a vernix style aphasia. So we generally categorize aphasias into the non-fluent category and the fluent category. Your individuals with non-fluent aphasia have to have some damage to Broca's area that is going to create an expressive deficit. Your individuals with fluent aphasia are going to have some damage to vernix area that's going to create a auditory receptive language deficit. And whether or not the arcuate fasciculus is damaged is going to determine if repetition is preserved or not. And if repetition is preserved in the expressive languages, we call that transcortical motor aphasia. If it's not preserved, we call that Broca's aphasia. If it is preserved in your receptive aphasia, we call that transcortical sensory aphasia. And if it's not preserved in your fluent aphasias, we call that vernix aphasia. So Broca's and vernix aphasia are more severe than the transcortical aphasias because you don't have preserved repetition. And if the entire zone of language is damaged, then we call that global aphasia. And these individuals are going to have deficits. They're not going to have any language whatsoever, usually, or very little.